Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org. Idaho Matters is taking a deep dive into the loss of farmland here in the Gem State. Are you a farmer? What challenges do you face as farmland shrinks in Idaho? We want to hear your story. Email us at idahomatters@boisestate.edu or leave us a voicemail using the Talk to Us feature in the Boise State Public Radio app. And then listen to our series on farming called Land and Legacy. Episodes available on Monday afternoons in the Idaho Matters podcast feed. More Idaho Matters from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. In the 1950s, a new and distinct sound changed the face of music, blending blues, gospel, and jazz. Rock and roll captured the spirit of a generation that was marching to its own beat. Driving that beat were trailblazers like Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Big Joe Turner, as well as legends like Elvis and Chuck Berry. This month, Dr. Kim Ganong, who is an adjunct professor with Boise State University's Department of Music, will be diving into this history in a series of presentations with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And she's joining us now for a preview. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Gemma. I'm happy to be here.
So can you talk to us a little bit more about the sound behind rock and roll and what influences were most essential to its early rise?
So I think most people know that rock and roll is based in things like blues and gospel and jazz. And one of the big separating elements there is that we electrified things, right? We started playing with electric guitars and amplifiers, right? And so that sort of moves us out of the jazz and swing era. And we also start to focus a little bit more on the lyrics and the storytelling as opposed to it being more of an instrumental genre like jazz. So I think people like Big Joe Turner, Louis Jordan sort of transition us through jump blues into what we know and love as the first wave of rock and roll.
Where did the term rock and roll even come from?
Yeah, that's a good one. So most people like to point to a particular DJ named Alan Freed, and he sort of gets credited with coining this term. And of course, like many things, we like to point to one specific person or event, who named it jazz, who named it rock and roll. Of course, the story is much longer than that. But we like to point back to, there's a specific song in 1922, a blues number by Trixie Smith, "My Man Rocks Me with One Steady Roll." So you've got both of the words in there. And generally speaking, a lot of people have come to the conclusion that it's really a euphemism. It's innuendo, right? This was not uncommon in a lot of blues songs. People like Lucille Bogan were singing relatively explicitly 100 years ago in their songs. And so that wasn't necessarily very appropriate to put on the radio, but it sort of transitions into things like referring to dancing or cars. And so you start to see a lot more songs like Rock Me or Shake, Rattle, and Roll. And you start to see those words popping up in titles of songs. And then, of course, Alan Freed does name his radio show The Rock and Roll Party. And that's when people sort of start to coalesce around this idea that that's what we're going to call this music, right? It took quite a long time for people to settle on that term.
So Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, as I mentioned, are some of the more recognizable names when we think of that 1950s rock and roll. But who were some of the early trailblazers that actually truly helped lay the groundwork for this particular genre?
Right. So like the rock and roll term, we also like to point to a specific song or person that started something when in fact it's usually not that simple. And so going back before that, we had boogie woogie pianists coming from what we would now call the Midwest. So that sort of really up-tempo kind of driving sound that was coming from a lot of boogie woogie pianists and people like Count Basie and a lot of me, Lux Lewis, a lot of these great solo pianists and band leaders in more of the swing era. But then that turns into what I mentioned before, jump blues. So we sort of simplify the big band. We parse it down to be a few people instead of 20 people on stage. It's more like 5 or 6 people, and that allows the music to be more straightforward and understandable. I think there's not as much going on. And it also allows people to focus on the lyrics. And so you get somebody like Louis Jordan, who used to sing with the Chick Webb Band at the Savoy Ballroom alongside Ella Fitzgerald. And so when the swing era sort of starts to die down, jazz kind of splits in a lot of different directions. And one of those directions is this thing called jump blues. And we get people like Louis Jordan, and they start focusing on the lyrics and telling a story. And we get people like Big Joe Turner, and he originally sings the song Shake, Rattle, and Roll, which then gets picked up by Bill Haley. And so this sound of jump blues, we sort of start eliminating some of the more jazz coded elements and
Hmm.
putting in some more what we might call pop elements. We start focusing a little more on electric guitars. And in that aspect, we see somebody like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who's a really fascinating singer and guitar player who is referenced and lauded as an inspiration by people as wide ranging as Elvis, Johnny Cash, the Rolling Stones, Bruce Springsteen, like all these different types of artists that will come later down the road reference her as an inspiration. And it's really incredible that often people don't talk about her. She was only inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I think, in 2018. And so it's taken a really long time to come around to the idea that she actually was a really integral part of this early movement, the sort of proto rock movement.
Can you talk a little bit more as well about the fact that a lot of early rock pioneers were actually African American artists? And then their work was often overshadowed because white performers started covering their songs. So, how did this dynamic shape the genre's growth and really the public image?
I think it happened in a lot of different ways. I mean, first there's just the logistical nightmare of the time. We didn't have what we now know as the Billboard Hot 100. The charts were
Hmm.
actually separated at that point. So we actually had three main charts. We had sort of the mainstream, your Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Rosemary Clooney, that kind of stuff. But then you had two charts kind of on the side. You had one that was sort of viewed as for working class white people, which was referred to as the hillbilly chart, which then eventually became country and western. Um, and then we also had the chart that was assumed to be music by and for the Black community, which was initially called race records, and then over time became R&B, rhythm and blues. And so it was literally separated in the industry. And so it was really difficult if you were an African American artist or more of like a folk or country artist to get on the mainstream chart, to get mainstream attention. And so I think that was just a logistical block. But then, of course, we also have, Jim Crow laws and segregation and all of that playing a role as well, because a lot of the venues and spaces were not open to certain types of artists. And, you'll hear in interviews people like Little Richard talking about playing in segregated theaters where, because he was a Black band, the Black patrons would be downstairs and the white patrons would be upstairs. And he said it was crazy. They started jumping over the balcony to come down so they could get closer. And he really felt like the music itself became something that helped to break down the barriers. And the younger generation
Hmm.
really got on board with this and sort of started to recognize that it's just music, and why do we need to put it in these categories? Why do we need to label it one thing or another? If we enjoy it, there's good music and bad music. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. So I think in that way it was a really unifying and progressive force in society.
Hmm. Tell me, what are you hoping that people learn and take away from your upcoming lectures with the Osher Institute?
I really hope that some people learn about artists they didn't know about, that they are able to reminisce. Obviously, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute is primarily an organization that caters to our older population. And so I think a lot of those people probably lived through this exact time that we're talking about. And so I hope that they take away some more depth and information about things maybe that they didn't remember, or things that they didn't have all of the information about at the time. I'm really looking forward to reminiscing with people and hearing their stories so that I can then share them with my students at Boise State, because most of them did not live through this time period. So yeah, I'm really hoping to get a great back and forth and have some good conversations about their experiences.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today. We've been speaking with Dr. Kim Ganong, adjunct professor with Boise State University's Department of Music. We've been talking about the history of rock and roll, and she will be talking more about this topic at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Boise beginning on October 13th. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.